Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Experts podcast, where we provide practical and straightforward advice on how to transform your business to be more sustainable. I'm your host, Vanessa Thompson. And in this episode, we're diving into the industry of conservation with our esteemed guest, Kevin Whilden. Whilden is the co founder of SeaTrees, an organization that has mastered the pricing model for $1 for one mangrove tree planted. Tree planting is an interesting market, with SeaTrees really leading in this space. They have partnerships with Virgin Voyages, Bank of the West, and WeTransfer, and have planted millions of trees. Today, we will learn how they are partnering with their businesses, how they've mastered this pricing model, and how their work is helpful for your business. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Vanessa. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I always like to give a little bit of context on the industry, and I just want to give three facts about this industry, which is really interesting. Tree planting is one of the most popular sustainability efforts. Almost with every government administration and most organizations, corporate administrations, engaging in some kind of tree planting efforts. China has committed to planting 70 billion trees. The US has committed to planting 1 billion. The African Union has their Green Wall Initiative, which is going to grow trees and create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Even Microsoft is planning to plant 8 million trees to offset some of their carbon emissions. And within that, sea trees and coastal ecosystems are particularly important. Most of these organisms actually can protect certain coastal regions from storms. Mangroves can actually reduce wave energy by 97%. So that really helps with our survival with adapting to climate change. Sea trees also provide nurseries for fishing, which helps the fishing industry. And almost half of the world relies directly on that. And the last fact is that oceans can sequester more carbon than any other ecosystem. So oceans are a really key part of stopping climate change. And they're almost this invisible forest because we don't see them. But even if we have 85% loss of that ecosystem, we might not even know it, but it really does impact our life. So to summarize, trees are really important for our survival. Sea trees are especially important, and governments and corporations are investing a lot in this sector. So for our audience, how does this conversation and topic, how is it relevant to your business? Sea trees are helping the fishing industry and any other industry that's dependent on the ocean. But beyond that, planting sea trees around facilities could actually help protect your facilities from storm damage. And most companies, either residential or commercial real estate, can be affected by these storms. So learning from Kevin today will bring you insights on how to survive the storm and thrive in this new climate. So before we kind of get into your story, which is really interesting, as well as sea trees, I would love if you just have any quick reactions to this information or any corrections to some of the statistics that were shared.
That was very, very well done. I think the key point here is that the ocean needs to be activated much more if we're actually going to reverse climate change and protect ourselves from the impacts of climate change. And the reason why is the ocean is 90% of all the carbon in the carbon cycle. So 90%, and only 2% is in the atmosphere. So if the problem is there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere causing climate change, the logical place to put it is in the ocean. But
Yeah.
only 4% of conservation funding goes to ocean-based projects. And less than
Mm,
and only 0.2% goes to carbon market-based funding for oceans. So
yeah.
it's a huge imbalance. And so we created SeaTrees as a way to solve that imbalance.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think a
Yeah.
huge part of that is because, this whole ecosystem is not really visible to most of us, at least on a day-to-day basis. But I want to get into your story and how you developed a passion that ended up helping you co-found Sea Trees. But where did this all kind of start for you? How did you first kind of become interested in this sector and how did you get into this?
So I got interested in climate change in the early 1990s when I was studying geology and learned about climate change and decided to do my graduate work in Antarctica in the mid 90s, studying
Wow.
climate change in Antarctica. And I realized, I mean, as a geologist, I am someone, I mean, again, I'm just a 22-year-old kid at this point. I could see how big the climate change problem was. And that's what I wanted to work on. And so I
Yeah.
basically had a job in pretty much every aspect of climate change you can think of since then.
Yeah.
And it was always a passion of mine to figure out a way to do it. I learned how to surf around 2007, 2008 when I moved. I was living in San Francisco, working in a clean tech company that was sequestering carbon in the ocean. This is sort of the
Mm.
early clean tech boom. And at that point, there was a lot of interest. This was when George W. Bush was still president around solving
Hmm.
climate change, a lot of investment, excitement. But then when Obama got elected, a lot of that died off because he chose to
Yeah.
do healthcare as his main priority. And kind of spent all his political capital on healthcare first, and climate change really didn't happen until his second term. And even then, it felt like there was a sort of de-emphasis on it. And it helped me realize that there needs to be more innovation on how we approach the problem of climate change. And the number one innovation was around storytelling, how we tell a compelling, engaging story that gets people to really connect with it. And
Yeah.
about that time, I was becoming a really avid surfer, and I realized the power of surfing and oceans to tell a
Hmm.
fun, interesting story around these problems that are really hard to grapple with.
Yeah. Can you share your hat for the audience here
Yes.
and
So
explain a
this
bit of
is
it?
says help California's kelp. So let me tell you about SeaTrees. So SeaTrees is a nonprofit. We're based in California, and we restore coastal ecosystems around the world. We call them blue carbon ecosystems. So mangrove trees, kelp forests, coral reefs, seagrass meadows, coastal watersheds, and other ecosystems that are deeply connected to the ocean and coastal health. And how we work is as a nonprofit, we find other local nonprofits who have their local project they want to run, and we fund their work and
Hmm.
provide also scientific support and storytelling and media content and capture support. And then our funding primarily comes from brands and individuals who want to support work like this in the ocean.
Yeah.
And our work is science-based. We collaborate with a number of different scientists around the world to make sure the projects that we're supporting are really well designed and operate effectively and communicate the data. And then we provide all that data as well as the stories, the content, photos, the videos to our brand partners to help them tell their story to their customers and their employees and other stakeholders.
Hmm. I love that. And I love that storytelling is also such a big part of this because I think that part of people having empathy for these projects is a huge part of storytelling. But I kind of want to hear also just about the early days of SeaTrees. How did this kind of idea first come about? And how did you first start with some of these projects?
Yeah, so I mentioned I started working climate change in the 90s before most everybody. I also helped create some of the world's first carbon offsets in the year 2000 when there was
Wow.
almost nobody making even knew what an offset was at that point, right?
Hmm.
And my business partner, Michael Stewart, who's the co-founder, he was also one of the first ever to sell a retail carbon offset, like right around that time. So they've
Hmm.
been following this world for a while. Remember the excitement and innovation in the early days of carbon markets and saw the sort of this boom and bust cycle recently. And we were
Hmm.
always, annoyed that we couldn't fund ocean restoration projects with carbon market finance because there's a lot of money in that.
Hmm.
And it's partly because it's really hard to do work in the ocean. The projects are more expensive, so the ROI doesn't pencil out. And even the science itself isn't quite as robust as it is on land. And so we had
Right.
to find another way around that. So we decided to launch SeaTrees as a already being a nonprofit that was doing work around climate change and oceans. We saw it as a way to develop projects that we could accelerate blue carbon ecosystem development without having to use carbon market funding. We would do it using a nonprofit model, using the tree planting model, which was very well proven, right? It's a very well proven thing,
Yeah.
but we call it planting trees in the sea or SeaTrees. And so you define SeaTrees in sort of fun, clever ways. So like a mangrove tree, one seedling is one, SeaTree. That makes sense. But what about a
Yeah.
kelp forest where kelp doesn't can't plant kelp on can't have trees and it grows really
Right.
quick. So we say like a square foot of kelp forest restored is one kelp sea tree, or one
Hmm.
coral reef fragment placed on a reef is one coral sea tree. And in a
Yeah.
way, we're actually quantifying the impact that brands, individuals can have by saying, "Hey, here's how much coral you just planted, or here's how much kelp you just restored." In a way that's very
Yeah.
simple and easy to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really great because, conservation has always really struggled to sell this to the corporate sector to showcase kind of that really quantifiable result that comes from conservation. And I think that's really great that you kind of targeted, okay, $1 for either it's one square, foot of kelp or it's, one mangrove tree planted. It's something that's really easy to communicate. And again, back to that storytelling, I think that's something that's really helpful. I know that now you're kind of switching your model away from kind of this $1 per one mangrove tree planted and a little bit more towards biodiversity credits. And I would love to kind of learn a little bit more from you and for you to tell our audience a little bit more about what that is.
Yeah. And just to be clear, so our different projects have different prices. So like $1 per mangrove tree is in our Kenya project in Africa, but like say our Baja California project is $2 per tree. And
Hmm.
each project has a different price depending on the cost to run the project.
Yeah.
But what we're really excited about right now is this idea of biodiversity credits. And so the way to think about a biodiversity credit is it's similar to a carbon credit, but it restores biodiversity and ecosystem. We
Mm.
actually call our system SeaTrees biodiversity blocks. It's like the building blocks of restoring coastal ecosystems. And maybe I can give a little bit sort of history of why this matters. I know that there's a lot of skepticism about carbon credits right now, what the value is. And can I take it back to the
Mm.
beginning for your viewers because I've been in this
Yeah,
space for so
absolutely. I love
long.
that.
So, the story starts like this: is that the word ecology and the word economy actually mean the same thing in ancient Greek. The ancient Greek word is called ecos. It means home. And ancient Greece people, as well as most indigenous cultures around the world, really see no difference between the value of nature and the value of their home economy, right?
Mm.
And it's only Western culture that has made nature what's called an externality, to where it has
Mm.
no fundamental value in our financial systems. That is the core problem of why we're in the mess that we're in now, right?
Yeah.
And this idea of a nature credit of some kind actually brings that external value internal to our economic system. That's the whole
Mm.
point, right? Is to put the value of nature, like the value of ecosystem services, clean air, fresh water, et cetera, bring it directly into our financial calculus of how we run our economy every single day, right?
Yeah.
The question is, how do you do that? It's not the sort of the easiest thing to do. And
Yeah.
it's also hard to explain. I mean, we're so deeply ingrained in our Western worldview of nature as this external thing that's
Right.
really hard to put that into our social systems. But this is how we do
Yeah.
it, right? So um, number one is just providing money to restore ecosystems. That's a way to do that. It's basically charitable, right? And
Mm.
in the carbon markets, all of the voluntary market fundamentally is charitable. Most people don't realize this, but you're basically giving money to projects that would not get that money otherwise, that benefit climate and not
Right.
creating financial value for the person who bought it. It's not like buying a
Yeah.
stock or a crypto. It's you're basically buying a credit that gets retired, and since it's retired, there's no more money left. It's only
Mm.
goodwill at that point. That's the value. Its value is goodwill.
Yeah.
And how you explain that goodwill and explain that the benefit of that is like that's the trick. It's how do you do that well? And we do that very well with
Yeah.
SeaTrees. We've been doing it for so long, and we've seen all the problems in the carbon world around that, where they've done a terrible job of storytelling. Right? Really, it comes down to
Yeah.
stories. Like fundamentally, it's about story, telling the story the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's something that's so true. And I don't think we realize that nature is truly a part of our economy until it starts to dwindle and we have limiting resources and it gets to a point
Right.
where it's really difficult for all of us. And I think climate adaptation, as well as a lot of these credits, are hopefully bringing that into the conversation. But how do you do that storytelling with businesses where you bring them into that? How do you kind of first open when they're thinking about, really how does this impact me on a quarterly basis? How is this something I could report to my investors? When they're thinking in that mindset, how do you kind of approach them with that story?
That's a great question. And I think we have a pathway that's designed to solve a lot of problems that we've seen in the last 20 years and how businesses really engage right
Hmm.
now. There are business frameworks like science-based targets and nature positive and
Right.
others that are trying to create, sort of a rigor and structure around how companies engage to bring the value of nature onto their balance sheet. Right. But then
Hmm.
how do you actually spend the money when it comes to, okay, you can reduce emissions and impact only so far within your company. And
Yeah.
because we've crossed tipping points in climate, you have to do more than just reducing your own impact. You have to actually rebuild and regenerate your ecosystems at the same time, or else it'll be
Yeah.
too late. And so that means essentially sending money to some other project somewhere else that does creates a benefit. And so
Hmm.
why we've launched SeaTrees biodiversity blocks is to basically make it easier, more understandable for companies to fund a project like, say, mangrove restoration or coral reef restoration or kelp forest, and know exactly how that project was set up, like what's the methodology behind it, and then see the transparent data collection that's set up year after year and report
Hmm.
back to it. And what we're doing that's unique is we're integrating in all the media content and storytelling along with it because for
Hmm.
so many corporate buyers of like planting trees or whatever, the story is the value. It's the goodwill that the company can generate through its,
Yeah.
keeping their employees stoked or telling the story to their customers or to journalists or investors or whoever, right? It's the
Right.
story is the value. And the reason that we launched this biodiversity credit called SeaTrees Biodiversity Blocks is to integrate our existing storytelling, which is excellent, with the science and the data behind it, and making
Mm,
sure that the projects are really well run and that there's full transparency of when someone
yeah.
buys one is to know, okay, hey, it worked, or wait a minute, there's a problem. It's not working as we thought, but at least it's open and transparent. It's not a hidden thing that a journalist uncovers a year later and then claims
Right.
greenwashing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really fantastic that you're not just selling that conservation effort. You're also selling a level of transparency and storytelling that goes along with it, which is, I think, something that's not really part of the credit market in general right now.
I would argue that's the biggest failing that we've seen in the last few years is the lack of storytelling and the lack of response to critical stories. Like
Yeah.
Vera did not do a good job of responding to the Guardian articles from 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why there's so much negativity. As an insider, I could see how the negative attacks from the Guardian, which have been doing negative attacks for decades on carbon markets, right? I could
Hmm.
see how they were stretching the truth and like twisting the facts in a way to provide a negative story. And there's a positive story as well, but the
Yeah.
market didn't really tell that. And
Mm.
the biodiversity market that's coming out, is projected to be a $2 billion market in 5 years from
Wow.
basically zero today. There's a lot of interest because there's a chance to tell a better story about something that
Hmm.
actually makes more sense. Like, what does a ton of CO2 even look like? And nobody
Right.
even the scientists like me have a hard time visualizing it, right? But
Right.
biodiversity is about like the trees and the coral and the kelp and all the critters like the otters and the snow leopards, whatever critter you like and whatever ecosystem is valuable to you as either a person or as a business. There's a way to tell a great story about that. It's just easy as long
Yeah.
as we can get around the pitfalls of avoiding greenwashing by having transparent methodologies and data collection and risk reports. Like it's another thing that like one of the problems that carbon had was they didn't communicate risk. Like there's
Mm.
always a risk involved in any carbon credit. Nothing's perfect, right? There's a risk in buying
Right.
a stock or buying crypto, whatever. Everyone knows that. But in carbon, no one communicated there was still inherent risk. They assumed that it was all
Right.
perfect. And as soon as someone said, "Oh no, wait a minute, there's a problem. These credits don't exist, or it's a scam," there was a
Right.
sudden shock, right? They were in shock. And at that point, the story is negative and defensive. And the
Yeah.
way we're doing it, people will know what the risks are up front. This is a difficult thing to do to restore ocean ecosystems. As long as our
Yeah.
buyers know, hey, this is the risk. Here's all the transparency, everything that about this. It's your choice to buy it, and then we'll tell you how it goes as time goes on.
Yeah. There almost needs to be a morning star reporting for these credits, just like a stock would be.
Well,
How do you
there
communicate?
actually are credit rating companies out there, and again, it's like they still don't explain the risk. I think the buyers need to have more
Mm.
awareness of the risk, better understanding of what it is, and especially in something with biodiversity and oceans, where it's so interesting and engaging in the first place. Like the
Yeah.
carbon credit, like I guess who cares? Okay, I'll let someone tell me if it's any good or not. But if you want to restore an ocean ecosystem, like to restore like bring sea otters back to the kelp forest, like don't you want to be more engaged with that? Like to me, it seems like a much more interesting story for the buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you communicate that level of risk to the buyers?
Well, so there's it's pretty down to details in terms of how we do a methodology, but we basically create what's called the SeaTrees blocks biodiversity methodology. It's on the Regen network, which is a blockchain-based registry, and they can go see how we basically design projects, what are all the factors we're looking at in terms of the science or supporting local communities or avoiding sort of double counting or whatever, right? And then as the projects operate, we create what's called a PD. It's a project description document. It's like a 50 or 60 page white paper that's basically technically
Wow.
describes how each project operates to produce impact, which we measure as a biodiversity block. Right? What we're measuring essentially is the uplift in biodiversity. So the way ecologists look at biodiversity is there's structure. Like it's a forest that means you need a habitat forming species like trees. And then you have all the critters that live in the forest or in the kelp forest, for example. And then you have is the ecosystem actually producing ecosystem services? Is it sequestering
Mhm.
carbon? Is it producing clean air or fresh water? Those are the things you look at and you measure, sort of average out over time the change and increase in those metrics to say, hey, this biodiversity is becoming better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that the buyers really appreciate that level of storytelling. How have your corporate partners reacted to that?
So this is so new. We literally just launched this last month at the Biodiversity COP in Colombia,
Wow.
COP 16. And we're in conversation with a few companies right now. You can actually buy them on our website. If you can go to SeaTrees.org, you can buy the biodiversity blocks for our first project, which is a mangrove project.
Wonderful.
And it's something that's going to grow, I think, quite a bit in 2025. And we already have one project launched. We've got three others in the pipeline. And the goal here is that we've created our methodology in a way that solves a lot of the technical problems that hold back carbon market innovation. Um,
Mm,
and we can launch new projects very quickly. If a corporate buyer said, "Hey, I really want to do a coral project in, say, the Caribbean," we've already got a couple of leads for that, and we could find and launch a project for them very quickly, or
wow.
anywhere in the world. So.
Yeah. And then for, the corporations out there who are looking to get involved either with, SeaTrees or another business in this regard, this is a really interesting in terms of the growth in this market. This is particularly interesting because you mentioned that $2 billion number in terms of looking at how this market's going to grow. How can businesses who haven't started looking into this start thinking about how should they get involved with biodiversity credits? If they want to go down that path, how should they be thinking about building out their strategy for getting involved in this market?
Well, I would say call us first because we're doing a lot of research on how do you do this? How do you connect biodiversity credits, which are so new, right? With like
Mhm.
science-based targets or nature positive, all that. Like we're in the middle of that research now, and we can help companies, they can tell us what their commitments and interests are, and we help them
Yeah.
think it through, essentially almost as a consulting concept. I
Mhm.
would also say that if it's a smaller company or you're just looking for a great CSR thing, like don't overthink it. You can still,
Mm.
it's just like planting a tree, basically. It's planting a
Yeah.
tree with better data, basically, essentially,
Mhm.
which is, I think, one of the
I like that.
problems that the tree planting business has had is that there's not been any standardization on it. And the idea of this biodiversity credit concept is to standardize how projects operate so they can be more efficient and more effective, and that the best project can be rewarded quicker. It's the whole point of
Yeah.
what markets do well, right? Markets reward innovation and efficiency very fast, composed of say grants or government programs or whatever. That's why I think
Mhm.
the market mechanisms around nature are so important. That's why
Yeah.
making nature an asset actually is the way we're going to accelerate solutions to somehow match the rate of tipping points. So yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to add on to that also you have this really interesting partnership. I believe it was with Bank of the West, where you had this kind of 1% interest, where the interest actually itself in the checking accounts was actually leading to conservation. And I would love to kind of have you share a little bit more about that with our audience because I think that's a really cool win-win. And also to kind of engage kind of for that bank to have a little bit more loyalty attached for their customers as well too. So yeah, I would love to kind of hear more about that partnership as well.
Yeah, that was a really cool one. I mean, I think banks are so critical for nature, and so many of our banks don't tell us how much they invest in fossil fuels.
Right.
And so finding banks that divest from fossil fuels is absolutely a priority for us, and encouraging our partners and our supporters to do the same is key. Now, Bank of the West, they had this what was called the 1% for the Planet checking account. So it's a
Hmm.
partnership with 1% for the planet, and they chose SeaTrees as the main beneficiary.
Hmm.
So purchases in that checking account, basically 1% of all those purchases went to SeaTrees. Now, Bank
Yeah.
of the West was purchased by BMO, a Bank of Montreal, and so BMO isn't doing the 1% for the planet checking account anymore. But for a few years, it was really cool. We produced some great content, videos around it, and it was a really fun one to basically find a bank that put their money where their mouth is around climate change, divesting from fossil
Yeah.
fuels, and finding great solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. How have a lot of these partners kind of reacted as you've built relationships with them? Of course, they'll reach out to you with kind of maybe some of these lofty goals in mind, but then once they actually come out to the projects or hear some of the stories, I'm sure that a lot of them are really moved. Have there been any real examples for you, at least, that have been really special, where you've seen some of these partners come out and really see the transformation that took place in that ecosystem?
Oh yeah, it's been quite a number of partners that have been stoked. I mean, it's not always easy to visit our projects and not always possible, but whenever we can
Mhm.
make that happen, we definitely want to do that. And we just did a thing with Virgin Voyages where they have one of the more sustainable minded cruise lines, and we there's a trip in the Mediterranean in Spain, and we have a seagrass and kelp restoration project in Spain, in Mallorca. And so we actually had, and the cruise ship went right by there. So people on the cruise ship made sort of ceramic kelp stones where you can attach kelp spores to the piece of ceramic and put that in the water to actually bring the kelp back. That's
Wow.
really cool. But we've had so many different videos with partners to basically celebrate what it is. We've been supported by surf companies like Quicksilver and Billabong and Roxy to do projects where we actually flew a pro surfer out to a coral restoration project and showed how
Wow.
the local people are using their local methods to restore coral, which is also good for surfing, right? And surfers appreciate it as well. And it's like connecting the fun of surfing and surf culture. That's part of our secret weapon, really, is to the joke that I make is the best way to make anything cool is to put a surfer next to anything. And all you have to do is watch commercials on anytime you're on television, and you see surfing appear all the time to help
Yeah.
make everything cool, right? And what
Hmm.
we're doing is using that power to promote sustainability and regenerative protection of our oceans through surf culture, which is very authentic because ancient Hawaiian culture, which is 1,000 years old, had one of the most regenerative, sustainable practices of any culture
Hmm.
anywhere. And it's still
Yeah.
quite strong today, and it's really coming back now. And surfing is that link between that ancient wisdom and the modern world, and it makes it fun, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. There's been so much research that I've read about Hawaiian culture also being able to cultivate better fruits through kind of restorative agriculture practices and agroforestry. It's really interesting. How do you connect with local people all around the world to try to cultivate more of these indigenous practices throughout your conservation?
it's really a priority for us to support the local people. I mean, they're the heroes here,
Yeah,
right? They're the ones that actually have the knowledge to make their local ecosystem thrive. And ancient
yeah,
peoples, indigenous cultures have always done that. It's just part of their DNA.
yeah.
Um, I have a couple stories for you. So in our Kenya project, which is producing the first mangrove biodiversity blocks, and these are the world's first marine biodiversity credits ever, right? They've been running the mangrove project for 5 years and restoring mangroves and protecting all the local animals like sea turtles and others, but they never really measured it in a way that they could understand it scientifically. So
Mm,
in order to produce the biodiversity credits, we had to bring scientists in to train them how to measure biodiversity and do like
right.
crab counts and fish counts and like tree measurements and all the different things you have to do to measure biodiversity. And they loved it. They loved being able to bring the science to understand what they already knew how to do as indigenous local people, right?
Yeah,
I have another story on that one, which is one that we don't tell a whole lot, but I'd love to tell it to the audience here, which
yeah.
is that we have what's called a coastal watershed project in Maui. The term is ahupua'a. This is the Hawaiian term for watershed management. And it basically imagine, most Hawaiian islands are pretty steep volcanic islands, and there's steep watersheds, right? And the the ancient Hawaiians had this term called ahupua'a, which meant the management and holistic care of that watershed from the top of the highest peak to the end of the furthest reef. And everyone who lived in each ahupua'a, which are marked by stone markers, where if you know where to look, you can still see them today,
Hmm.
had to manage that ecosystem for their own benefit. And
Right.
otherwise, they couldn't survive because Hawaii gets dry and you get fires, and even back then, right? They didn't have
Yeah.
fire trucks, they didn't have plastic water tanks or anything. Like for them, water storage was the landscape and a healthy landscape. To the extent where in Hawaiian culture, the word for water is vai, and the word for wealth is vai vai. So literally
Hmm.
the word for water is wealth in Hawaiian culture. And that's getting back to this idea of nature assets and valuing nature in the same level we value money, right? But let me tell
Yeah.
you a story about this project in Maui, because this is actually quite extraordinary. So everyone remembers the tragic fires in Lahaina, right, two
Right.
years ago. And it just so happens that we had been restoring coastal watershed, basically clearing up invasive plants and planting native plants as restoring ahupua'as just south of Lahaina for 3 years. And 1 month before the fire started, we cleared this really key stretch of invasive plants that were along the coast, which is like a thick layer of like mesquite trees that were planted by colonists, Western colonists to make it hard for the locals to get to the ocean because mesquite trees have lots of thorns and they didn't have shoes. And it's also good for cattle, which again is like in the days that colonizing thing to bring cattle to a place that didn't have cattle. And so these mesquite trees were taking this fire. Because mesquite is like charcoal; it burns really hot, and the fire was spreading south of Lahaina along this sort of coastal strip of mesquite trees. It was about to hit another point where it's going to hit another sort of large, sort of settled area and burn hundreds of more homes. But a month before the fire happened, we cleared this like basically a couple hundred yards of this mesquite brush and created a natural fire break, and the fire actually
Wow.
stopped right at our project. The project itself
Wow.
is operated by Regenerative Education Centers in Maui. That's the local nonprofit that we've worked with. And Eddie Garcia, sort of the proprietor of that project, like he's a force of nature for restoring nature. And big props to Eddie for basically being part of that solution, because if he hadn't done that work, it would have burned hundreds of more homes that day. And unfortunately, we don't tell that story too often because like the situation there is tragic, like beyond belief, especially for the locals
Right.
who have really been oppressed, for hundreds of years now. And we're a white California-based NGO. We revere Hawaiian culture for what it is, but
Hmm.
it's really hard to tell a story like that in a positive way. And so it's on our website. We produced a little video in our blog post. If you want to link to it, I can give you the link to it.
Yeah.
But it's where you can say the words watershed restoration saves lives. And
Hmm.
that's the whole point, is that um, for companies and individuals who care about nature and are concerned about climate change and biodiversity crisis and other things like that, there are ways to give back that matter, that make a difference. And it's a matter of going out there and finding the ones that feel right to you, that have the
Yeah.
right story, that have all the proof points behind it that you're looking for, and then connecting that to the values of yourself or your company as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a perfect example also about how climate adaptation can really help all of us. And it's something that we all need to be thinking about as individuals, but also as businesses as well too. All of these conservation efforts can really, really help when it comes to, whether a home stands or not. In a lot of these natural disasters that are becoming more and more severe, how can we adapt to that? I know that there's whole cities that are now trying to start to think about integrating these principles of indigenous principles, conservation principles, all of these things into their city planning so that they can actually survive these really extreme storms as well. I don't know if, your conservation efforts are part of that climate adaptation aspect of this, but it's certainly having a lot of that benefit in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. And you never know what's going to happen. Like the thing with Maui, we had no idea it would stop the fire was even coming,
Right.
right? But we knew it was good to build resilience in our ecosystems, and that's really what it's about: is how do we build resilience using nature as
Hmm.
as our guide, and indigenous wisdom as sort of the the guide for how we apply restoration.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it almost kind of reminds me of, I know a lot of insurance companies particularly are getting involved with this too, because this ends up really impacting kind of not just their triple bottom line, but also their bottom line as well. There's so many areas of the United States and all over the world where insurance companies are just simply not offering any type of insurance when it comes to fires and other natural disasters because they know that the risk is too high now. The frequency and severity of a lot of these storms coming through is just too extreme. But having them kind of invest in biodiversity credits really makes sense for a lot of these businesses. There's so many different wins that come about with that, not just in terms of helping the local community, but also helping the business to try to save a lot of assets surrounding those communities as well too.
That's exactly right. You said it very well. I think it's about rebuilding resilience in the face of sort of ecosystem collapse. Like we can do it. And
Yeah.
indigenous wisdom is really, how we have to channel that into our Western culture as a way to make
Hmm.
that part of it. I mean, there's the proof points are endless. It's just a matter of doing it now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had saved this question, which now I feel kind of speaks for itself. But in terms of kind of sharing with our audience some of the benefits that come with conservation, and I think we've talked about a lot of them. But if you were kind of to talk about a few, of course, carbon sequestration is part of it, protecting physical assets on the ground, protecting people's lives, protecting communities are all part of these conservation efforts, particularly in coastal communities. But is there anything else that you kind of want to share in terms of the benefits to businesses specifically? with all of these conservation and particularly the biodiversity credit as well.
Yeah, well, so for the business, again, like I mentioned earlier, that in the voluntary market, whether it's biodiversity credits or carbon credits, they're fundamentally charitable, right? Whoever buys them, retires them, they're not getting financial value back. Now that can change. There's certainly an investment case in the carbon markets now. Biodiversity credits aren't there yet, and they shouldn't be there for several years, in my opinion, while we innovate better ways
Mm,
to run the projects so they're more transparent and more effective and more efficient. But eventually there'll be a business case as well with nature assets. So that's one
yeah,
way. But I think in the very short term, it's about what are your values as a company? What impacts do you want to have on the planet that we
yeah,
all love and enjoy? And then how do you tell that story to all of your stakeholders that matter? And what we found is that employees are just as stoked by the projects when SeaTrees gets involved as the customers are. In fact, it's oftentimes more valuable for the employees than anything. And so
right.
we would, I mean, these are conversations we welcome with any company that wants to reach out to us. Like, how do we create the story that works for you? How,
Mm,
because we have a lot of projects that we'd love to do that we don't have the money for. But if we could find the right partner with the right story, then hey, we're ready to launch. Let's make it happen.
yeah, absolutely. I love that. Well, is there any last advice that you have for our audience? And also, where can our audience find you and support all these great projects?
Our website is seatrees.org, SEATREs. Well, you can link to it. And we also have a link to all of our films that we make on our website, which I think people should watch. We have a
Yeah,
filmmaking team. We're quite proud of our content. They're usually like 5 to 7 minute type films. And yeah, we'd love to hear more.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's been a pleasure.
I hope that this episode gave a bit of hope to our audience. We are in a really scary climate crisis. However, when we do take action, nature has a beautiful way of recovering. There's been so many case studies where there's been huge natural disasters in a particular area where all life is wiped out. And when you conserve it and make sure it's not bothered for a few years, life bounces back with a full ecosystem. Nature has a beautiful way of recovering and flourishing once again. Ecosystems can have wonderful comebacks, even when we give them just a little bit of attention. If everyone here purchased one tree after this episode for just $1, we could help recover an entire coastal ecosystem today. Nature is a part of all of us. Let's give back to Mother Nature and do something meaningful. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Sustainability Experts.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Sustainability Experts. If you liked the insights from our podcast, feel free to reach out to us on our website. We produce episodes with world-class executives every month and offer exclusive consulting and speaking services globally. Reach out to us and become a leader in your industry.